What's going on, guys? TG or ThunderGod here, and today I'm talking about Team Hebi and who they could take on in the Akatsuki. Now, this is an interesting conversation topic I've never really seen anybody talk about, especially considering the main purpose of the cell, on top of, hunting down Itachi and all that, was to stop any intrusion on Sasuke versus Itachi. The group actually has some pretty solid showings against the Raikage and Killer Bee. With that being said, we're going to be looking at each Akatsuki member and seeing who they could feasibly defeat if they came across such a Akatsuki member. That being said, make sure to like and subscribe if you're new here, and let's get into the video, guys. So starting off, I'm going to be talking about Hebi momentarily before going into the matchups themselves so we can get a gauge of how strong everybody really is. Starting with Suigetsu Hozuki, heralded as the second coming of the demon, a younger brother of Mengetsu Hozuki, he was an individual whose goal was obtaining the swords of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist. Suigetsu does obtain the Executioner Blade from Zabuza's grave, the same blade that regenerates with blood, making him believe he may have surpassed Sasuke while wielding it. Suigetsu is implied to be a rival to Jugo, the original bearer of the curse mark, as it stated they had fought multiple times in the past. However, this is Suigetsu without this Executioner's Blade. This same Jugo showed impressive feats against the 4th Raikage A and Killer B. This would be consistent as he's shown reacting to Killer B's attacks and even having a confrontation with the Raikage's right-hand man, Darui. Suigetsu also has some impressive feats, being able to react and block attacks from Version 1 Raikage, who was able to blow his sword off due to it being cracked in the Killer B fight. On top of this, Suigetsu has probably one of his strongest attributes, his not intangibility, but his hydrification technique, a hallmark of the Hozuki clan, where he essentially is intangible or he denses into water from physical attacks. The only real downside of this is that when someone hits him with Raiton or lightning, he's extremely weak to it. Jugo, whose blood was used to develop the curse mark, is an absolute animal when actually looked at. People attempt to downplay Jugo due to the Raikage clapping him around, but this same Raikage was able to combat Mangekyo Sharingan Sasuke and speed around Naruto with his Kyuubi cloak, so the Raikage is also an animal. Jugo in his curse mark one stage is able to pressure, quote unquote pressure Sasuke to use his curse mark stage 1. However, this also could have been Sasuke's attempt to show his identity. Could be either or, could be mutually exclusive, doesn't really matter. You could even assert that Jugo is superior to Suigetsu based off the fact that he closed a much shorter distance than Suigetsu potentially did in blocking Darui and the Raikage V1, who both seem to be relative in their attack speed against Sasuke. When he turns into Curse Mark Stage 2 is when Jugo becomes monstrous. When Jugo gives into his killer impulses, he gains immense strength, actually being able to react momentarily to Version 1 Raikage and successfully blocking / surviving his physical attacks. On top of this, Jugo is capable of producing beams that warranted great distress from C and Darui, both of which fully know what the Raikage was capable of. Now we have Karin, who is the sensory ninja / healer of the group. Her healing prowess is amazing, able to heal Sasuke from multiple life-threatening wounds, like when he got stabbed a bunch by Killer B. She's also a sensory ninja, actually having sensory powers that are said to surpass ocular powers. Being able to pinpoint the enemy's position along with erasing her own chakra, she's a very useful asset to Hebi. Karin also has access to the Uzumaki chains. Now, it's a bit questionable if she's able to pull it out at this stage, simply due to the fact that it's described in the data book that they came out more so as a result of her forgiving Sasuke and his life being at stake. So I don't think I'm really going to include them, just because it's a bit questionable if they can even come out at this point during her career as a ninja. We then have the leader of Hebi, Sasuke Uchiha, who in the first half of Shippuden is this rogue force that is hyped up to an insane degree. Off his first appearance, he was able to instill fear for the very first time in the Sai, something Orochimaru and Four Tails Naruto were unable to do. Sasuke was able to dominate Team 7. It can be argued that Team 7 wasn't at full strength, as Naruto knows he's still weak from having the 4th tail come out, as well as Sakura potentially still suffering from her 9 tails wound, akin to that of poison. However, there are multiple statements regarding this encounter, placing Sasuke above Team 7, located in the data books. Along with this, Naruto finds himself inferior to Sasuke regardless after the fact, so you would just say he still thinks he's below Sasuke even with all his strength. And on top of that, just the scenery and cinematography of the scene, if you want to call it that, shows Sasuke above every member of Team 7. Orochimaru even calls Naruto garbage in his 9 tails three-tailed cloak after getting his arm wrenched off by him, noting that him and Sasuke aren't even in the same league. And it's actually, in all likelihood, that Sasuke is stronger in this, as he's shown abilities that Orochimaru himself hasn't seen, like the change in chakra form when he does like the Chidori spear against Orochimaru. And even the data book kind of implies this, with it stating that Orochimaru somewhat misread Sasuke's progress up to this point, with lore stating he has strength exceeding that of the Akatsuki, which is to be interpreted as he's Akatsuki level, or a threat to the Akatsuki, which is consistent at this point in the series. Sasuke is an absolute beast. Sasuke also would be comparable to himself in the Killer Bee fight, as that Sasuke is noted to be weakened physically, not recovered from his fight with Itachi, and have lost a curse mark. That Taka Sasuke is worse than Hebi Sasuke, only in the fact that he has a Madarasu in his Mangekyo Sharingan. But even then, he has zero mastery with it, zero experience. He's extremely fatigued, not fully recovered. So that Sasuke would be, in fact, logically inferior to the Hebi Sasuke, unless you think his base Sharingan got amped to that degree to where he's stronger than Curse Mark Stage 2, which is not true because he only really hits that threshold when he's in the Kage Summit. In which case, Sasuke does take a beating. However, he does have some pretty decent feats where he can react to version 1 Three Tails Killer Bee. He actually taps off Bee's head and uses the momentum to flip over Bee. Now, this isn't fully indicative, as Bee's movements are more so linear, which allowed Sasuke to do this. It's not like he was just moving in an unorthodox pattern as earlier. But overall, Hebi has some pretty solid showings. I'm going to just get right into the matchup as not to waste too much more time with it. We have the Confident W's category. In this category, we have Zetsu, Hidan, and Deidara. I put these three in the same tier, as Hidan and Zetsu are definitely not taking down the entirety of Hebi, let alone, Sasuke himself. Zetsu is pretty fodder, minus Black Zetsu finding a host, so I'm not really going to, go too much further on that, as obviously when he has a powerful host body, he has some ridiculous feats. Hidan, while having some impressive feats like fighting the Two Tails, is pretty garbage in terms of jutsu stats and overall intelligence. I find it very unlikely he'd pierce any of Team Hebi, especially with Sasuke, who has, for example, the Orochimaru style substitution, or Suigetsu, who can't be hit by physical attacks. Jugo can also augment his curse mark to harden into blade strong enough to clash with Darui's sword, so it's extremely unlikely he'd be taken down as well. You could potentially make a case for Karin, however, but she is a sensory slash healer, so she wouldn't be in the front lines regardless. As far as Deidara goes, I don't really feel like I need to cover it too much, but I'll elaborate on it briefly. Sasuke obviously beats Deidara. Some people won't give it to Sasuke, even though before I even get into like Sasuke versus Deidara, Obito was assisting Deidara by placing landmines. And the thing about Sasuke versus Deidara, not a lot of people look at this fight really closely, is that Sasuke's base ground like combat speed was very threatening to Deidara, to the point where Deidara actually got tagged on the ground and he was forced into an aerial, more ranged assault, to where obviously Obito placing the landmines mattered, because Sasuke was also able to evade the missiles that Deidara shot at him. So Sasuke forced Deidara into his strongest position and Sasuke's weakest position. And this is just base Sharingan Sasuke. This isn't even counting Curse Mark 2, which is a 10 times multiplier on all his stats. So we really just, it's not there for Deidara, honestly. And some people will bring up like he can react to Curse Mark 2. He doesn't. He just sees through the Genjutsu and places a clone. He actually never reacts to Curse Mark 2 Sasuke at all in that fight. The only time he does is somewhat when Sasuke like throws shuriken at him, but that's like shuriken that are weighted down and not Sasuke's own body. And you could also just say that Sasuke's like flying speed is inferior to his just raw ground combat speed. So the Deidara fight, on top of Deidara having assistance and losing, isn't really relevant here. I'm not even gonna bring it up. Like I mean, I just did, so I guess I contradicted myself. But yeah, not really relevant in this case. Sasuke did beat Deidara. I stand on that. So Konan, also, I gotta throw in here, not that impressive to me, to be honest. She has some pretty decent prep time feet. I don't want to say decent, they're very good. She was able to kind of clap around Obito with a great amount of prep. And I'm talking like huge amounts of prep, like Shikamaru type status. So that's well and good, but she kind of gets bodied by base Jiraiya, which kind of like puts her in this category. Not saying base Jiraiya is weak, but she just kind of gets sprayed with oil and then grabbed by Jiraiya's hair technique. So it's just kind of like, it's just kind of not a good showing. She doesn't really do too much. Even like her jutsu arsenal, it's like her paper is just gonna get blown away by the fire, even if she can like resist water in the rain. So like Suigetsu's jutsu. I also want to point out the fact that some people will try and say, or like wank irrationally, that she's like relative to Sage Mode, QB infused like Naruto, the one that's like charging at Nagato. This is just outlandish to me, as Naruto stops his momentum halfway through and is like skidding across the ground to like stop himself. And even then, right, like he stopped halfway through, she still hasn't reached the point where he's going to reach. So he's like stopped halfway and she's still dashing to where he's going to be. So it's very clearly that like even when he's like done, like she's still not up to his level of speed. So she doesn't scale either. She's not really relevant in this discussion. You know what I'm saying? Just not really good feats. Honestly, can really, you know, the people who Hebi as a unit have taken on are far above her. And I guess you could kind of say, like, would Hebi be able to take on base Jiraiya, which I feel like they would. So, you know, kind of that's a good way to look at it. So the debatable categories where, you know, it's possible for both sides to win. I'm just going to kind of give my input on it. First up, we have Sasori. Now, this is somewhat dependent on if you think Sasori is stronger than Deidara. Not going to get too much into that, you know, really just your own opinion where you think Deidara was lying about Sasori being stronger, or maybe you think, you know, Sasori scaling to the war arc with his like Kazekage scaling, whatever, you know what I'm saying? Not really gonna matter too much in this, but Sasori is interesting as he has an interesting arsenal. I do believe it's possible for Hebi to win, as the minute Sasori comes out of Hiroko, he's gonna have a ridiculous time fighting 3 opponents at the same time. Now, I don't see the Hiroko puppet tagging any member of Hebi, especially these, you know, this group was able to tangle with B and the Raikage and able to react even momentarily to these fighters. The Hiroko puppet is just not there in this regard. And on top of this, in the original fight, Sasori was in a position to where he only had to deal with one puppet master / one opponent on the time, whether Granny Chiyo was just fighting him or Granny Chiyo was controlling Sakura. Sasori was essentially fighting one opponent the whole time, and he's going to be fighting 3 here, and this is especially a big issue for him if Sasuke gets close with his ridiculous combat speed that could result in Sasori being dismantled. And again, I do think all of Hebi would be able to at least react to his attacks in the Hiroko puppet. I also think Sasuke would be able to perceive Sasori's core being the source of his chakra and be able to pinpoint a win condition much earlier than Chiyo and Sakura. You can make the same argument for Karin as well, who could hang back and sense Sasori while he fights Hebi. Sasuke also does have the feat of being superior to Sakura. Now, I kind of mentioned this earlier with the Team 7 stuff, so this kind of does get into Sakura versus Sasori, who, I mean, at the very least, Sakura was able to begin to read Sasori's finger patterns during the fight, and at points react to attacks meant to kill her, but this was through playing dead. I do believe Sasori's best chance, though, is to overwhelm Hebi with the Red Secret technique performance of 100 puppets, which could take everybody down, or, you know, his third Kazekage puppet, where he, like, shoots out iron sand everywhere. He's definitely gonna have to do a crazy AoE attack if the fight lasts that long, or attempt to overwhelm them. But again, if Sakura and Chiyo could do well against these like fodder 100 puppets, it'd be hard to say like Sasuke along with like Suigetsu and Jugo wouldn't be able to just dismantle them the same way. I don't know why anybody would say otherwise, but yeah, so I mean, I do see it as a win condition, especially if like all the, again, the poison actually does end up affecting all of Team Hebi. You know, everything's coated in poison, so like are the molecules of, or like the micro sand grains from his iron sand. So it is possible that Sasori could just poison them and, you know, definitely get a GG through that. I do believe, however, this fight would end sooner rather than later, as Sasori is not built for group combat. And even if you argue he begins to pressure Hebi, you can make the argument that Sasuke would A, read his patterns much faster than Sakura, as he has the Sharingan, and B, this isn't talking about Curse Mark Stage 2, again granting him that 10 times buff. Before absorbing Orochimaru, he's also able to blitz all of Team 7, so this kind of does depend on how you see Sakura in relation to Sasori, Deidara in relation to Sasori, and Sasuke to both those characters. In my opinion, Sasuke would be above Sakura and Deidara at this point. Not saying he would be able to beat Sasori alone. However, with Hebi supporting him, as the whole formation with Hebi is Sasuke at the front, Suigetsu and Jugo on the sides, and Karin in the back with a diamond formation, he would have a much easier time. Similar to Killer B, a fighter Sasuke would have no business challenging one-on-one. So I think it's definitely possible for him to take on Sasori. And if he does, it's going to end a lot sooner than it does with Sakura and Chiyo versus Sasori. So So I think it's pretty possible that Hebi could take down Sasori at this point, just from Sasuke's feats in relation to a bunch of these characters, along with Suigetsu and Jugo. They have some crazy jutsu as well. A lot of their stuff isn't too relevant in this arsenal. So for example, like, is Suigetsu able to liquefy through, you know, the third Kazekage's like Iron Sand? I mean, I don't know, you know what I'm saying? Like, how would you determine that? So, you know, kind of a lot of factors, but we're going to move on to the next Akatsuki member. Kakuzu. I think Kakuzu is going to be a much harder fight for Hebi than Sasori, as Kakuzu is a much more physical brawler and has shown to fare well against someone with a similar arsenal to Sasuke in the form of Kakashi. Kakuzu being an individual who can throw hands with Kakashi, you know, and Choji all at the same time, and who also required the Rasen Shuriken to be thrown to eliminate all 5 of his hearts. Kakuzu also has no issue with a group of opponents, as his hearts can jolt out and fight on their own. This would be especially bad if Kakuzu decides he would fight himself alongside them, which would cause Hebi a lot of issue, as Sasuke would be more than likely forced to deal with Kakuzu or the hearts, and Kakuzu dealing with the rest over. Now, it would be possible for Sasuke to eliminate hearts from Kakuzu himself, as Kakashi did due to Kakuzu's diamond hardening being an earth style technique. And it's also interesting to discuss how Genjutsu would play a part in this battle, as we don't really see Kakuzu react with it too much. So it's definitely a possibility, but to give credit where credit's due, it's likely Kakuzu would have some countermeasure from his years of experience. So I won't go on and say Genjutsu GG, but I could see Genjutsu being a reason for him losing his initial heart. So I won't throw it out, but I won't like call it this end all be all either, because it really wouldn't be at this point. A big issue with Kakuzu too is that not only are his hearts able to fight, but their attacks are insanely powerful. For example, they're able to, you know, shoot massive wind style attacks, which Sasuke actually doesn't have a good defense against, because his fire style would only magnify it, and his lightning would not be effective against it. They're even able to magnify it by combining wind and fire. So this also does depend on who Kakuzu goes after, as he could attempt to fight Jugo or Suigetsu while Sasuke takes on the hearts, which he does have a good chance of taking out, as in Curse Mark 2 he actually can fly, which was a big issue for Kakashi as well. Now, I do believe Hebi is more likely to take down Sasori than they are to take down Kakuzu, just due to how Hebi fights. So for example, in the B fight, right, they're just all jumping B. Now there are ways they could work together and take down Kakuzu. So for example, right, let's say Kakuzu does his diamond hardening, he could actually, like, for example, punch Suigetsu. Suigetsu would liquefy and Sasuke could Chidori him, similar to B. So there really are a lot of ways these different fights could go, but I definitely give Kakuzu a higher difficulty fight than Sasori, just for him being generally considered a stronger Akatsuki member with better feats. And he just like has a better arsenal, more suited to take on groups of opponents. So I could definitely see Hebi struggling a lot more. However, it is possible for Hebi to come out with the W. Kisame. Now, this is the last of the debatable categories, as when it comes to who Hebi has the potential to beat, it can actually be theorized that Sasuke made Hebi specifically to fight Kisame while he takes on Itachi alone. As he notes, Hebi existed to make sure nobody else interfered, and Sasuke has seen / knows of Kisame's existence as Itachi's partner, so there is the potential for that. Now, Kisame has actually a bit of a tougher time, as he struggled quite a bit even with Base B in their fight, almost getting punctured by a chakra infused pencil. On top of this, Kisame doesn't have a ridiculous amount of chakra to absorb in this fight, so his strength wouldn't be shooting up to epic proportions like it was during the B fight. Now, what's interesting is that Kisame and Suigetsu in the anime even have a prolonged scuffle lasting longer than duration of Sasuke versus Itachi. Now, it's pretty blatant, they're both playing around, but I do think it says something that Suigetsu is able to match Kisame in a sparring sort of match for a prolonged time without going all out himself. I also think it's interesting that Kisame's water style might work against him in this matchup, as first and foremost, Suigetsu would definitely benefit quite a bit from Kisame's water style jutsu. So he'd be able to only use his own water style jutsu. He has access to the water release Tate Oboshi, where he liquefies his body and makes that giant bubble that covers himself in large quantities of water and erects a giant shield out of that water, where countless attacks bounce off the solid wall. Now, this water bubble was actually able to push back the A-Tails, who was charging towards Hebi, so Kisame shooting out large amounts of water would benefit Hebi as well. And the reason I didn't really bring this up for the other matchups is because it's only really relevant when Suigetsu has access to large amounts of water, or the terrain is
water infested, like where these other matchups might not be, or he wouldn't have access to it, compared to Kisame, who can quite literally change the environment through his water style. It's quite ridiculous. And we also know Kisame has also shown the ability to shoot out attacks comparable to Might Guy in his 7th gate. So if he does decide to shoot out that shark absorbing attack, it can really just absorb anything Hebi throws out jutsu wise. And on top of this, if Kisame does merge with Samehada, it could turn into be a big issue for Hebi, as they're not going to be able to maneuver around the water. This obviously doesn't apply to Suigetsu, but I believe it'd be a bit of a leap to say Suigetsu could take on Kisame in his fused Samehada state. The trade-off with all this water style, however, is that Sasuke's lightning release becomes that much more effective against Kisame. And there's even the prospect of, if he gets Kirin ready and the jutsu is able to activate, with that much water around, and let's say even if the water bubble, right, let's say Sasuke's not even caught in the water bubble and he just Kirins it, everybody in the water bubble would just be absolutely annihilated. So really, it just depends how the fight goes. Again, none of these are really concrete. I just think there is the possibility of Hebi being able to come through, take a victory, especially with Hebi showing feats that they're able to take on some pretty impressive opponents and react to certainly impressive attacks, along with having some pretty powerful jutsu in their arsenal. I definitely don't think it's outlandish for them to be able to combat and possibly take a W against all of these Akatsuki members, and this is them fighting as a group. Now, when talking about all three of these fighters, it is debatable because I would argue that all of Team Hebi, or at least Sasuke himself, your opinion, whether in base Sharingan or CM2, can combat these fighters. And on top of this, Sasuke does have access to a healer on his team. So even if Sasuke is fighting a hard battle, he always has the option to heal while said person is still engaging in combat, which is a luxury none of these individuals have or can do. So that is a big point, and that is a reason he was able to do as well as he did versus B. He would have died multiple times in that fight without a healer, but because he did have access to Karin on his squad, he was able to combat B very well. B being an opponent who was leagues above Sasuke at this time. This isn't even accounting for the fact that Hebi works extremely well as a team. They actually have really good teamwork when it comes to battles. So for example, even when like Jugo gets hit with the Genjutsu in the 5 Kage Summit, Sasuke snaps him out immediately, or when Sasuke goes down in the B fight, Suigetsu blocks and Jugo attacks. They're very, very good together, and there's just a lot of lore that suggests that Sasuke himself would at the very least not beat these fighters, but be able to put on a good fight. For example, you know, Kisame thinks Deidara is pretty strong, so you could imply that he thought Deidara might be relative to himself. You know, there's a lot of really good stuff out there that suggests Sasuke would be able to combat these fighters at the very least. And when you throw on Hebi, we have displays on how they take on far stronger fighters, which is why I think this tier and these fighters are debatable, even if you don't necessarily think that Sasuke himself can beat these fighters. It's more so the whole squad jumping them. Okay, it's now possible with their ridiculous jutsu and all this crazy stuff. This is where the possibility of a W for Hebi stops, plain put, as we're dealing with Akatsuki members who are entering a tier of their own. Pain, Obito, and Itachi are just in a class of their own when comparing them to Hebi. It's not logical to say Hebi would be able to stand in the same ring with any of these opponents. I'm not even going to insult your guys' ears by talking about these matchups, as the main deal with Hebi is that they're more so like assisting Sasuke in his fight. And the problem is when Sasuke himself isn't relative or able to combat said person, it becomes an issue for Hebi, who just kind of gets clobber stomped. And this is kind of the case here. They're not taking down Pain. They're not taking down Obito. Itachi, obviously, like whether you look at his prime or whether he's like ultra like dead or fatigued, doesn't even matter because they can't beat the Susanoo. It's just really, I think that's it. Like, there's not really much more to talk about with these Akatsuki members. I'm not even going to insult you guys. So that being said, make sure to like and subscribe if you're new here, and hopefully you enjoyed the video. Let me know down below, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.